It's not just technical ways of calling things, of constructing sentences. It's a whole philosophy that is behind the language. It is a reflection of our view of the world ethos. When you speak many languages, you're opening many doors. Even if you cannot open them entirely, you at least open it a little so you can see a little bit what is in there.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dri Thérèse Assié-Lumumba shares the lessons of 3 decades in Africana Studies at Cornell University.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we are joined by Dri Thérèse Assié-Lumumba, director of the Institute for African Development and professor in the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell.
Dr. Assié-Lumumba has been involved with a variety of initiatives related to African languages in her over 20 years at Cornell, and we are excited to hear all about it. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Dri.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'm happy to be here.
So I do have to say it is actually quite exhausting looking at your CV and all your accomplishments. Before we dive deeper into the history of African languages at Cornell, can you please tell us a little bit more about your background with languages and also your research interests?
Okay, background to languages. I will start by saying that this year marks my 30th year at Cornell.
Wow.
I came as a Fulbright Senior Research Fellow, expected to stay a few months. And a few months led to what it is.
Yeah, we know how that goes.
Later. So in terms of language, I'm from Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. And in African countries, usually, you're de facto bilingual.
Mm-hmm.
Because you speak your own language and you're exposed to so many other languages.
Yeah.
You may not speak them fluently, but you know enough to have conversation. Like my own language is called in the language family of Twi, Akan language that is spoken, different variations between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. But I know enough of Bamana, for instance, which is a lingua franca in West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
The version in Côte d'Ivoire is called Jula, but it's the same, originating from Mali.
Mm-hmm.
So I know enough to go to the market and negotiate the price of commodity.
Yeah.
And I know how to have short conversation in many other languages. So that's the reality of the African continent. Often language, the multiplicity of languages is shown as a problem, as a deficit. On the contrary, it should be seen as a source of wealth, because I'm going to cite here, quote, someone who's writing inspired me. I think either she's a Norwegian or she definitely from one of the Scandinavian countries. And her name is Eva Engholm. In her book entitled Education Through English, the Use of English in African Schools, that was published a while back by Cambridge University Press in 1965. I would like to quote here because it's so powerfully an expression of what a language should be seen and considered. She said, "Language is the key to the heart of a people. If we lose the key, we lose the people. If we treasure the key and keep it safe, it will unlock the door to untold riches, riches which cannot be guessed at from the other side of the door." That's what it is. Each language has It's not just technical ways of calling things, of constructing sentences. It's a whole philosophy that is behind the language.
Yeah.
And I was telling in one of my classes recently, in a discussion many years back with a mathematician from Cote d'Ivoire, he made me aware of how we structure sentences when we're counting object.
Mm-hmm.
Typically in European languages, they will count, they will say the number before they name whatever they're counting.
Yeah.
In African languages, they will name the thing before they say how many. And then we had this really eye-opening conversation that all this, even the way we count, is not just technical, is a reflection of our view, of the philosophy, of the world ethos. So when you speak many languages, you're opening many doors, even if you cannot open them entirely. To use the metaphor of Engholm, you at least open it a little so you can see a little bit what is in there. So that's what it is in terms of the reality of African languages. Of course, they present some challenges in terms of which language to use in the school. And if you're going to use everybody's language to teach them in the early years of learning, how do you produce the textbooks? How do you produce the teachers who are not only able to speak the language, but who are trained as teachers to convey a content? So it has its own complexities and difficulties, but at the same time, it's a source of wealth. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. I can't agree more. This is beautiful.
So you wear many hats at Cornell and in the academic community. How has the field of African studies changed since you arrived at Cornell, both on our campus and at large?
Okay, here maybe I should clarify something, because it's not only here at Cornell, but globally, there is not a clear understanding always between, in terms of the difference between Africana studies and African studies.
Mm-hmm.
African studies is the study of the continent. And Africana studies is a field, is a discipline that incorporates Africa and the diaspora, because it was determined that you can't understand fully what's happening, what's going to happen in the diaspora, be it in the United States or Brazil, if you do not have an understanding of Africa, the place, the people they came from, the history. I had, in parenthesis, this morning at the IAD, I have introduced as a director a new program called Global Africa Monthly Webinar. And it was on Africans in science. It was just fascinating. A presentation on ancient Africa. And then the Africans who came against their will in the context of the transatlantic enslavement. They did not come only by force to work with their hand in the plantations. There were skilled scientists who were brought here as well. So there was a fascinating presentation on that, and two other presentations on where we are, and the very equally inspiring futuristic perspectives. So that's what Africana Studies decided, those who founded it decided to capture that. The inevitable synergy, necessary synergy, connection, convergence between Africa and its diasporas. The late Ali Professor Mazrui referred to global Africa in terms of the root and then the branches. And the branches cannot advance and say, well, now we have grown, we have luxuriant leaves, lot of fruit, so we can forget the roots. So imagine what happened. And the root cannot be a tree unless there are those branches. So they determine to have that connection in terms of the worldview, in terms of philosophy, in terms of courses. So that's how Africana Studies, that A, has a very powerful meaning philosophically and educationally, programmatically. And by the way, Cornell was the place where that idea of Africana Studies took place. And now you have hundreds, perhaps thousands of Africana Studies, but it started right here at Cornell. And the founding director of Africana Studies, he retired recently, Professor James Turner, and students played a significant role in imagining, creating that space that was named in terms of program as Africana Studies. So it included Africa. But there is another possibility that you find in many other academic institutions where they study African studies. So it's the continent. Even if they connect to the diaspora, it's not their main focus. So here at Cornell, at Africana Studies, we have all this conception of global Africa, to use that term. But then the Institute for African Development, it focuses more on issues of Africa. And what I'm trying to bring in is to also that connection with the diaspora. So then moving toward Africana Studies, that the idea that we can understand best, we can understand and plan best for development if we have that dynamic connection. And also in the contemporary period, there are continuously people coming from the continent. So the migration to this part of the world, for instance, didn't stop with the forced migration in the context of the transatlantic enslavement. There are people who are still coming in. So when you're thinking of Africa, then it is important to take into account those. So these are clarification about African studies and Africana studies. But in terms of the field itself, well, since I came about 30 years ago, as I mentioned, it had just celebrated its 20th anniversary when I came here. So it has become more a reality. Some people thought that it would be some, fashionable thing and it will just disappear. But it is in academia. It has disrupted academia positively in such a way that it's here to stay. It has created a space for social, institutional transformation, intellectual engagement that necessitates that space that is called or that is represented in Africana Studies. So this I navigate personally between these spaces.
Yeah. So when you reflect on the teaching of African languages specifically at Cornell over the time that you have been here, have you seen any specific changes? I know that you have served on the Cornell University Language Education Council a few years ago, and you also served as chair of the Committee on African Languages and International Studies. What were some of the things related to African languages that these committees have accomplished?
The broader language education committee, there was a lot of excitement because the languages are related to how you open to the world. Of course, English is becoming more and more like a global language, but there's a reality that is there that is not covered by the English only. There is a class that uses English as a language of professional language. But there are many, the majority of the people in the world, they function even professionally in other languages. So if Cornell is going to enhance its international position, it has to give some kind of thinking and practical ways to manage the language component. So a lot of discussion was done around less commonly taught languages. So there was a lot of excitement, and I sincerely hope that this committee will be resuming sometime.
And it is actually
Okay.
the language. It's now called the Language Council, and of course, this past year has kind of put a little damper on everything, but it has been reinstated by Wendy Walford. Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear that because language is really critical.
Yeah.
But then for African languages, when I was doing the report of the committees that I chair, the committee on African languages at Cornell University, I interviewed the founding director, whom I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed one of the most inspiring language teachers. He taught Kiswahili for more than 30 years at Cornell. I would say in parentheses before I move forward, I was teaching a course on education and sustainable development in Africa. And one of my students, an African-American student who was doing his PhD here at Cornell, we used the text on education for self-reliance in Tanzania. He said, I must go to Tanzania. I said, well, what will you what do you plan to do? And we talked about it. Say, well, how are you going to prepare to go? And then eventually we talked about the need for him to master a language because one of the aspects that he found the most fascinating is that the first president of Tanzania made of Swahili a language of instruction. Starting with the basic education, and he went all the way to the university. And there were issues, I will come back to them, about the perception of African languages, which were not actually considered languages. They are dialects. So it was to diminish the significance of the African languages. Or they will not be able to capture complexities. One of the things that the late President Mwalimu Nyerere did was to translate Shakespeare in Swahili.
Yeah.
Okay. So he was not trying to make a point, but he was an intellectual, present intellectual, and he was doing those kind of innovative enterprises, very inspiring. So the point here is that when I interviewed Professor James Turner, he said at the time when Africana Studies started, they thought of African languages as an intrinsic part of such a project.
Yeah.
But at the time, as he explained, it's when Tarzan movies were still showing, where you see those episodes where you hear those people who are not supposed to be fully, really advanced in their thinking, in their capacity to express themselves, the whole colonial cliche of the primitive societies, prelogical societies, those people who cannot articulate. So these are not real languages. You can't hear them. You cannot make sense of them. So it was quite a battle. So the battle to establish Africana Studies as a field with equal recognition as any other so-called traditional field included the battle to accept African languages. The same way for language requirement, you can take French or Russian. You must be able to take an African language if you wish. So now it appears, it sounds like it's normal, but at the time, it was not a normal thing. Well, you are trying to establish this new field. Now you want to bring all sorts of things that don't make sense. African language. But now it is accepted. You can take Swahili as for your language requirement. You see?
And Yoruba.
Yes, of course, Yoruba. And when I came here, they were teaching other languages also, Bamana. And then we used to have also, I was coming to Yoruba, we used to have also Zulu here. There was a professor of literature, PhD in English and other things, but also knowledgeable in Zulu. She was here teaching Zulu. But now the languages have been reduced in terms of the ones that are taught here on campus. They are reduced to two, Kiswahili and Yoruba. But arrangements were made using the technology and the concept of a partnership to provide other languages that were offered or are offered off-site. One of them is Zulu, I think, is with Yale, and Wolof, it was with Columbia University. So there have been those evolution, but in terms of, I haven't looked at it recently, but the enrollment, it was quite impressive. That's why I don't know how this professor did it. Professor Mwalimu Nanji that I mentioned, he had at time more than 100 students in a class. And he was such a fascinating, dedicated teacher. You have a class full of all those students. You walk past a room, you see him one-on-one with another student. Yeah, here is another side where you see a group of students doing some work together. So I'm going back to this student who told me he was going to Tanzania. And I told him, get prepared. So I told him, go to see Mwalimu Nanji. I was just astonished when the next semester I saw them standing in the hallway, chatting and laughing. When you can laugh in a language, it means you have some understanding beyond the basic. So I was looking, I said, wow, how did you do it? So languages have evolved. And we're hoping that they will continue to be strengthened. Yoruba was added not long ago, but the teacher, I know him. He has actually taught language section in some of my own classes, very passionate and knowledgeable. So we hope that it will continue to grow.
Yes.
And I know Kiswahili has been now connected to some of the programs like Global Health, where they have this exchange program with Moshi in Tanzania. So there are possibilities, many other possibilities. In the report that I wrote, when I finished my 3-year term as a chair of this committee in the Africana, we made several suggestions that we hope they will, some of them at least will be implemented, that we will connect the language with Cornell abroad, students who go abroad in specific countries, how we prepare them, not only in terms of the culture in abstraction, but the culture with the language. And not to see the language also reduce it to just technicalities of say hello, hello. We need to give more substance to teaching of a language, learning the language of the people you're going to interact with. So there are many, many potential areas of growth that are there.
That's what we love to hear.
Yeah. Well, so what would you tell a language learner about why they should pick up at least one African language?
Oh, yes. That's why I quoted this book. When you pick an African language, you're opening the door a little bit on this fascinating continent. I personally travel a lot. 2 years ago, I was giving a talk, very prestigious talk, at the University of Johannesburg, of one of the heroic figures in the context of apartheid. And it was a new lecture series that had been created. And I looked at the bio. I don't know if can be called bio or CV, but something of the two people who presented before me. They were so detailed. I said, but I cannot. They say, well, in honor of the memory of the person who whose name is the lecture series bears, you have to do that. So in that context, I was made to find a number of countries I have visited in the world, including African countries. It was that detailed. So this one, I found that I need to make a little more effort. But I had, at the time, in terms of countries where I have had substantive presence, 30 countries in Africa.
Wow.
Many others, it was passing through. You spend a day at an airport waiting for that long flight canceled, and then you go do a little bit of sight. They were not counting countries where I have gone, where I have some kind of substantive connection. But I'm saying this because I'm always fascinated. When I travel, I realize that I should be even more humble. Because the more I travel, the more I realize that there is so much there that I do not know, that I need to know. We cannot reduce the African continent, even if there's a Pan-African project. That doesn't mean that Africa can be reduced to a very homogeneous region. So there's an incredible complexity, wealth, that I discover every time I travel to a different site that is very much connected to the language. And so language is very important. If you learn a language, you're opening a little bit the door to that fascinating continent.
Yep. I love that visual of opening doors.
Yes. You also serve as the recently re-elected president of the World Council of Comparative Education Societies. Can you tell us a bit about your work in this role?
The World Council of Comparative Education Societies that I had, when I became president, they elected me in 2016, and I brought a few innovations. And one of them was to create two journals, two peer-reviewed journals. One, a short one, 3,000 words, for people, junior scholars. But then we found out later that senior scholars also enjoyed submitting papers in that. But another one, a fuller journal called Global Comparative Education. Ideas of global citizenship. What can we do with education to create precisely the world I was talking about? So that journal, and both of them, we published in the 6 languages of the United Nations, which means Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, Spanish, and these are the 6 languages. Maybe I don't know if I skipped one, but these are the 6 languages. And when you publish your article in one language, we translate abstract in the other 5 languages.
Oh, nice.
So you can also check, Google it. I will send you the link. You'll see it. It's just trying precisely to create many doors where they are exploring different things.
Before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share your favorite word in a language that you speak, that you love, that you are learning, that you want to learn. What is that favorite word of yours, Ndri?
There are so many great words. Many great words. But one that I would like to use is a word that is guiding a lot of my intellectual contribution in the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
The word itself is used in Southern African languages, different slight modification. But in terms of what it contains, what it conveys, you find it across the African continent. And that word is Ubuntu. Ubuntu, which reflects that common humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Ubuntu that reminds us that we are interconnected, that human-centered, that collective ethos, that I am because you are. Our existence is common. And it's not only we, the human, who have this capacity to dominate, transform, but we have to also acknowledge what is our surrounding, our physical surrounding. So the social surrounding is a necessity. We are connected. We have to recognize our common humanity. But we need to also acknowledge the existence of the earth, of the living things, the animals, the trees. And in different talks I have given recently, debate I have participated in my role in UNESCO, in the World Council of Comparative Education Societies, I have referred to what this little virus has reminded us of, that we're not the only one on this planet. We, the human, we can be kind to each other, but if we're not kind to the environment, it will not be kind to us. If we mistreat the animals, it will not have great return for us. So this is the Ubuntu. It's a very powerful word with a content that reminds us that we need to act in whatever we do as not acting in a vacuum, not being alone.
Yep.
And if we must accept the idea of competition, it should be in terms of competing to do the best for everybody. It's not to do whatever you can to outperform everybody for your own individual advancement. It's the collective advancement, collective well-being. Happiness is not a zero-sum commodity.
Yes.
We all can have as much happiness as possible. It's not because you have a lot, you're so happy that it should translate into sadness for me. No. So what can we do together in this world?
Dri, this has really been wonderful, and we appreciate your thoughts and everything you've shared with us so much. Thank you very much for speaking of language with us.
Thank you again, and have a great weekend.
Next week, Cassandra Glynn, Pamela Wesley, and Beth Wassel will join us on Speaking of Language.
They gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series titled Social Justice and the University Language Learner, and we will extend our conversation about this topic on our podcast. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.